I noticed back around 2015 or so, with the resurgence of the left in democratic, that's small d, and perhaps capital D as well, democratic politics, I noticed suddenly a lot of chatter about something called class reductionism, the idea that there were people out there who were just so blindly socialist and blindly economically fixated that they were diminishing, ignoring, or somehow denying even the other forms of racism, gender bias, and other kinds of bigotry in this country. And I wondered about that because I don't know any of those people. And my next guest, who has for many years been a professor studying the intersection of race and politics in this country, has written a piece called "The Myth of Class Reductionism." Adolph Reed Jr. is very well known in this area. And I look forward to welcoming him now. So Dr. Reed, first of all, thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I'm quite happy to talk to you. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. I think since the Bernie campaign of 2016, even perhaps. But let's start with it. Who are these people that I keep hearing about that are supposedly denying the existence or the importance of things like racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on, because all they care about are class issues? Who are they? I haven't met them.
Well, I mean, I'm like you. I haven't met them either. I mean, I have no idea who they are. I think they're basically a debater's trick. Right, and it's one that's common enough, like in academic life as well as elsewhere. You attribute to an unnamed opponent an extreme stance that no actual people take, and then you tear down substantive arguments by linking them to this extreme fiction that you've posited, but that nobody really embraces. I mean, as I've said in the piece, I think, to some extent, this might be a leftover caricature of a certain strain of new left positioning after in a certain tendency on the ultra left after the meltdown of SDS at the end of the 1960s. In some cases, it might be like a folk legend that reaches back to the beginning of the 20th century. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, the dominant tendencies in left politics now have always given, I would necessarily say pride of place, but have always been conscious of the dynamics of race and gender that have historically, in some ways, if not undercut, at least impeded, right? I mean, the struggle to build a left politics in the U.S. And but the fact, because look at it. I mean, I'm an old guy, and I'm a product of the New Left. The leadership of the trade union movement are basically people who came out of that generation, if they aren't younger. And that was all about the moment of the civil rights movement, the second wave of the women's movement, and nobody, again, that I know of or know personally, know of or read, just as you say, Richard, has ever embraced that kind of stance. The closest thing to it, ironically, was the Clintonite DLC wing of the Democratic Party in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, which advocated trying to bury race as an issue and in some cases even gender as an issue in what they considered to be an appeal to moderate Republicans or the conservative fantasy, or the fantasy of the conservative white working class. But it's never been a position on the left, or at least not not in any of our lifetimes.
Well, and as you say, it seems to me the left has always been on the forefront, and I'm including, the farthest left we can imagine, the Alabama Communist Party in the 1930s or what have you, that left thinking, class-based thinking has always been in the lead on this. And when I invert it, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but when I think about it from the other side, I'm hard pressed to find a so-called, people posit that or claim that there's this tension between class awareness and identity, quote unquote, class versus identity. But all the civil rights or identity leaders of history, most of them I can think of, had some kind of class awareness, whether it was, I believe, Martin Luther King identified as a socialist. Malcolm X talked about capitalism as being, an obstacle to real progress, and so on. So I'm not, I think it feels like, other than perhaps this fractional debate within the left in the 60s, this feels almost like a recent invention on someone's part.
Well, no, I think that's right. I mean, I was moved, for instance, Joanne Reed on MSNBC a few years ago described universal programs as amounting to a notion that the rising tide lifts all boats, and attacked this as a form of class first reductionism, when in fact the rising tide lifts all boats lines as an alternative to redistribution was in fact the pet claim of her favored Clintonite wing of the Democratic Party, like it's not a left program at all. And I've also indicated, but I think I mentioned in the article, that from the 30s through the end of the 60s, a consistent position on the part, well, at least ironically up to Black Power, a consistent position on the part of key figures on the left edge of the civil rights movement was that a redistributive program and social or expansion of the social state and expansion of the trade union sector were essential, sine qua non, for the advancement of Black Americans' rights, because Black Americans would, for a variety of reasons, disproportionately likely to be workers and poor people and so forth and so on. I just quoted like a powerful statement from Pauli Murray, the left Black female lawyer and civil rights activist, to that effect in a law review article in 1945. In fact, she went so far to say that that the only way effectively to combat employment discrimination is through is to hinge it to a full employment policy, right? And of course, this was the debate between the advocates of the Title VII approach to an FEPC in 1964, and the proponents of the Humphrey. I don't know why I'm blacking on his name. He's from Humphrey Clark Bill S. 1937, that would have tied fair employment practices to a much broader manpower and full employment policy that reached back in some ways to the mandates of the 1945 Full Employment Bill. So yeah, I think this is a very recent invention, and I think it's not only an insidious one in some ways, but it's also itself, as I mentioned in the piece, a class program. Right. I mean, it's what this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, absolutely. You do mention it in the piece, and that's what I wanted to get to. I just wanted to remind our audience that we are talking with Professor Adolph Reed Jr. about the myth of class reductionism, because one way to put it is to just, in my mind, is to say, well, if I represent a financial and political elite that does not want to cede power to a mass movement, that does not want redistributive economic programs or forms of economic democracy, robust working class. One of the easiest ways to do it, it seems to me, is to say that any discussion of class, of the working class, of working people's rights, and so on, any discussion of anti-poverty programs, anything that flows economically from that, is a reflection of basically implicitly racism, sexism, bias, and that the only appropriate political stance to take as a quote unquote liberal would be to offer lip service to equal rights and point to a select few individuals from marginalized groups who have been put in prominent positions as examples that the status quo as it is working just fine. Thank you very much.
Well, yeah, I think that's right. And also, I mean, look, there are two contending views of a just world that are at play here. One of them, which is very much a class-based view, is the view that strict equality of opportunity, that is real equality of opportunity, should be the standard, right? And is the only standard that we need for a just world. And what that would mean in a society like this one that has become increasingly unequal over the last 40 years plus, is that the model for this kind of just world would be that if 1% of the population owned or controlled 90% of the assets in the society, it would be just so long as 13% of the 1% were black, or half female, and 14% Latino, and whatever appropriate percentages gay or transgender. And that is an objectively defensible notion of justice and of equality based on normative premises. But those aren't normative premises that have ever been shared by what we would think of as a left, but by what anybody would reasonably think of as a left. I'm reminded that the sociologist Rogers Brubaker noted a few years ago that ethnic identities and other specific identities exist all the time among people. People have a lot of them, and they move or flow in and out of them. But those identities, or any given identity, is likely to become politicized when it's taken up by a group of what you might call political entrepreneurs who want to pursue agendas that require the support of a population much larger than the number of people who benefit from the realization of that agenda, right? And that's kind of where we are with this kind of identity politics. And again, as I said, like one of the best ways to tell that a class program is being advanced is if people is the extent to which people deny that it's a class program, basically.
Well, and that's a great point. And I want to reiterate that for folks, that when I just want people to understand that, at least in my view, as well as yours, as I understand it, when you hear people say, well, advancing a working class agenda is somehow denying the rights of black or brown people, women, gay, or whatever transgender, that in effect, what you should recognize when you hear that is the sound of a privileged class, knowingly or unknowingly, in the case of any given individual, defending its interests and weaponizing identity on its behalf. Is that, from your view, a fair statement?
Absolutely. Perfect. It's a perfect statement, I think.
So the question then is, I guess, what do we do about this? I mean, for one thing, we talk about this. I'll make another statement and see what you think about it. I've made the statement online and gotten heated response for it. I'll go a step further, which is I know many, many black, brown, female, gay, Jewish, Muslim leftists, people who are struggling for a better and more just economic order. I know that there are millions of people who meet those categories, who support Bernie Sanders or some other form of what we would think of as a left agenda. I'll go one step further and say that when someone presents a class reductionist argument, I could argue that's racist because they are and sexist because they are rendering these millions of people of color and women, etc., invisible to suit their own ends.
Well, yes, I mean, absolutely. And in fact, I mean, my son, who's an historian, has actually been calling this a race reductionist line, because that's basically what it is. Because black people or brown people, or whatever, lose their identities as workers, as homeowners, as students, as debtors, as landlords, as creditors, and are all reduced to the one characteristic, which is moreover a fictional one at that, of race. So yes, I mean that's a literal textbook understanding of what racism is.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but I encourage everyone to read the article in the New Republic that was published last week, The Myth of Class Reductionism. So Professor Adolph Reed, Jr., thanks for writing it, and thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, well, Richard, thanks very much for having me. I really enjoyed our little conversation today.